Why would any man waste a dance on her? Look at her, boys.
Why would any man waste a dance on her? Tracky Hamilton raised his glass with a smug grin, and every boy in a tuxedo burst out laughing. Savannah Williams, 18, paralyzed the billionaire's only daughter, froze as a single tear slid down her cheek. Look at her, boys.
Miss Williams isn't paralyzed. A dislocated L1 vertebra, a pinched nerve root. 12 hospitals missed it.
Then a black serving boy stepped forward, jaw-tight eyes burning. Miss Williams isn't paralyzed. A dislocated L1 vertebra, a pinched nerve root. 12 hospitals missed it.
Shut your mouth! Somebody get him out of here!
Across the ballroom, the billionaire father shot up from his chair, as if catching the last flicker of hope after 2 long years. And the boy never imagined those few words would change both their lives forever. The chandeliers in the Bellwood Academy ballroom did not come alive until late in the evening, but Wesley Williams knew the room best at 4:30 in the morning when it belonged to no one. He moved across the marble with a mop, in slow, even strokes, the way his father had once taught him to move, when a thing mattered without hurry, without waste. The great windows were still black. His reflection slid along the floor beneath him, a thin figure in a gray uniform, and he did not look at it. When the floor was done, he crossed to the far wall where the grand piano sat under a quilted cloth the way it always did between recitals. He should have left it alone. He told himself every morning that he would leave it alone, and every morning his hands disagreed. He lifted the cloth back just far enough to free the keys and sat on the edge of the bench, and he played quietly, barely pressing a few bars of a Strauss waltz that lived somewhere underneath his ribs and would not be evicted. His fingers knew the phrasing the way a person knows the stairs in his own house in the dark. It did not match anything else about him. A busboy who scrubbed floors before dawn had no business with that kind of touch, and Wesley was careful that no one ever heard it. Bellwood Academy had stood for 200 years on a hill above the harbor, and for most of those 200 years, it had been a place built by and for the oldest white families in Charleston. Wesley had arrived 3 years earlier as its only scholarship student, and the school had absorbed him the way still water absorbs a stone, a brief disturbance, then a closing over, then nothing. The other students learned his uniform before they learned his face, and after that they did not need his face at all. He was the boy who refilled the water pitchers. He was the one who carried the trays. He was in the polished language of that place staff, and staff were furniture that walked. He kept 2 things that were his. One was a tarnished silver locket on a thin chain his mother's worn under his collar, where the heat of his skin had long since stopped feeling it. The other was a worn medical notebook of his father's, its spine softened by other men's hands before his, its margins crowded with a careful slanting script. Wesley read it the way some boys read scripture. There had been a clinic once. There was no clinic now. He did not let himself think much past those 2 facts. It was Coach Daniel Moore who first looked at Wesley and saw something other than a uniform. Moore ran the rowing program and had been an Army medic before that. A heavy-set white man in his 60s with a voice like gravel and very little patience for the school's gentler cruelties. One afternoon, a sophomore had gone down hard on the boathouse ramp, and by the time Moore reached him, Wesley was already there kneeling on the wet planks, splinting the boy's wrist against a folded towel with a speed and certainty that made the coach stop in the doorway and simply watch. Where did you learn that Moore said when it was done? It was not quite a question. Wesley gathered the towel and rose. My father had a clinic, he said. It's not there anymore. He did not explain, and Moore, to his credit, did not press. But the coach remembered it. After that, he made a point of saying good morning to the boy by name, which was a smaller thing than it should have been, and a larger thing than Wesley let himself admit. The night of the party, the ballroom was a different country. 400 guests filled it under a forest of chandeliers, the women in silk that cost more than Wesley earned in a year, and the men in black tuxedos that all somehow looked identical, and the air smelled of lilies and money. Wesley moved among them with a tray of champagne held flat on his palm, and the room arranged itself to flow around him without ever quite seeing him, which was the only kind of seeing he had come to expect. There were exceptions, and he had learned to find them. Eleanor Brooks was one. She was 81 years old, a small white-haired woman who had spent her working life as an orthopedic surgeon back when very few women were allowed to be one, and she sat near the windows in a chair she had clearly chosen for the view rather than the company watching the crowd with the dry, unimpressed attention of a woman who had outlived most of the people she had ever needed to impress. When Wesley offered her the tray, she declined the champagne and looked at him instead. Frankly, the way one looks at a person and not a function. "You carry that like it weighs nothing," she said. "Posture like that, somebody trained you." He moved on before she could say more, but he felt her eyes follow him, and it did not feel unkind. There was a younger woman too near the orchestra with a glass she wasn't drinking from. Claire Delacroix had married into one of the families that night's party existed to flatter, and she wore the discomfort of the room on her face like a guest who has realized too late she has come to the wrong house. Twice Wesley caught her watching the way the crowd treated the girl in the wheelchair, her mouth tightening, and twice he watched her say nothing, because saying something in that room cost more than most people there had ever been asked to pay. The girl in the wheelchair was the reason for the party, though. By the look of her, she would have traded the whole evening to be anywhere else. Savannah Williams had been 2 years before the kind of young woman the city told stories about, a ballet prodigy as a child, a ribbon-winning equestrian. By 15, the only daughter of Harrison Williams, whose fortune had been built on the country's hospitals. Then a horse had gone down under her on a wet course, and the spine that had carried her through 1,000 turns had stopped carrying her at all. Her father had spent $32 million chasing the word impossible across 12 of the finest hospitals in the Western world, and 12 times he had been handed the same slow shake of the head. The girl who came home from all that traveling was quieter than the girl who had left. Her mother had organized the party as a kind of hopeful campaign, a way of returning Savannah to the society she had once decorated. Earlier that week, in the long, bright kitchen of the Williams house, her mother had floated the idea of arranging a partner for the first dance, a tactful young man she'd said someone who would understand. Savannah had set down her fork with a care that was its own kind of violence. "I'm not going to be danced with as a charity," she had said. "If no one wants to, then no one will, and I'd rather know it than be lied to." Her mother had let the subject drop. So she sat at the edge of the floor that night, in a gown the color of pale champagne, her hands folded in her lap, and she watched the dancing begin without her. One by one, the young men of good family found reasons not to come near her. They bowed to other girls. They drifted toward the bar. A few approached as if they meant to ask, and then veered off at the last moment, as though her chair were a step they had not seen, and stumbled over. Each small avoidance was performed with perfect manners, which made it worse because manners meant they had thought about it and chosen. Then Tracky Hamilton crossed the floor toward her, and the room felt it. There had been a time before the fall when Tracky and Savannah had been the picture the city kept in its mind. The senator's son and the doctor's daughter, the brightest pair in any room. He had loved her then, or had loved being seen beside her, and somewhere in him the difference had never fully resolved. What he could not forgive her for was not the chair. It was that she had been perfect, and his loving her had felt like proof of his own good taste. And now the proof was sitting in front of 400 people with a blanket over her knees, and he could not bear to be reminded that he had once chosen her. So he did what cowards do when they cannot stand the sight of their own reflection. He went to break the mirror. He stopped in front of her chair with a glass in his hand and a half-smile on his face, and he spoke just loudly enough that the people nearest could hear, and then the people past them, the silence spreading outward in rings. "You really came," Tracky said. "I'll give you that. Tell me something, Savannah. What's the point of dancing with a broken doll?" The words landed, and the music seemed to thin, though the orchestra played on. Savannah's chin came up a fraction and held, and then her composure cracked along a hairline fracture, and her eyes filled. She did not give him the sound of it. but the tears came bright under the chandeliers and 400 people watched them come and did not move. That was the part Wesley would remember. Not the cruelty, he had a long education in cruelty, and it no longer surprised him. It was the stillness. The room had decided all at once, and without a word, that a girl's humiliation was a thing one endured politely like a long speech, and that the price of stepping into it was higher than the price of watching. He saw Claire Delacroix's knuckles go white around her untouched glass. He saw Eleanor Brooks's jaw set hard. He saw the girl's father across the room, frozen between fury and helplessness, a powerful man rendered briefly useless by the same etiquette that ruled them all. And he saw the line. It ran invisibly across the floor between where the staff stood and where the guests danced, and Wesley had spent 3 years learning exactly where it lay so that he would never accidentally cross it. He knew that to cross it was to make himself a target, and that making himself a target in that room for someone like him was dangerous in ways he had spent his whole life avoiding. He found Coach Moore's face in the crowd. The old medic was watching him, and when their eyes met, Moore gave the smallest possible nod, not an order, nothing so simple as that. Just a man telling another man that he was seen, and that whatever he chose, someone in the room would stand behind it. Wesley looked down at the tray in his hands, the careful pyramid of glasses, the thing that marked what he was supposed to be. Then he turned and set it down on the nearest table deliberately, the way you set down something you do not intend to pick back up. He drew off the white serving gloves one finger at a time and laid them beside the tray. The waltz he had played in the dark that morning was still in his hands. His father's voice was somewhere underneath it. You help because someone needs it, not because someone's watching. He crossed the line. He did not hurry because hurrying would have looked like fear, and he had decided somewhere between the table and the floor that he was done being afraid in that room. The crowd parted ahead of him the way crowds part for something they don't yet have a name for. Tracky turned the half-smile still on his face and began to say something, but Wesley was already past him, and the cut of simply passing a man as though he were not there did more than any answer could have. He stopped in front of the wheelchair and went down on one knee so that his eyes were level with Savannah's, which no one in that room had bothered to do all night. Up close, she was not the porcelain figure the gossip made of her. She was a young woman with wet lashes and a fierce, exhausted dignity, looking at him with the particular suspicion of someone who has learned that kindness usually arrives with a bill attached. "Don't," she said low for him alone. "Whatever this is, I don't need to be anyone's good deed tonight." "It isn't that," Wesley said. "Then what is it?" He held out his hand palm up between them, not a grand gesture, a steady one. "I think the doctor's got something wrong," he said quietly enough that it stayed between the two of them and whoever stood close enough to lean in. "Not all of them are wrong by accident. But I've read the way they describe what happened to you, and I don't think it's what they think it is. I think part of what they called permanent isn't." He let that sit between them for the length of a breath. "Dance with me, and let me show you." Behind him, somewhere in the crowd, a man's voice rose sharp, scandalized, demanding to know who had let the help onto the floor. Wesley did not turn around. He kept his hand where it was open, waiting his eyes on hers, and the whole gilded room hung over the two of them like a held breath, waiting to see whether the girl in the chair would take the hand of the boy they had spent all night looking past, and whether anything in that long, cruel, beautiful evening was about to change at all. For a long moment, Savannah only looked at the open hand in front of her. Then she put her own into it lightly, the way a person tests the temperature of water, and a sound went through the crowd that was not quite a gasp and not quite a murmur. The sound of 400 people discovering at the same instant that the evening had stopped going the way they expected. That was when the headmaster came across the floor. Jeffrey Sutton had run Bellwood Academy for 11 years and wore the institution like a second skin, and the sight of a uniformed busboy kneeling before a guest had brought a flush of real outrage to his face. "That is enough," he said loud enough to reclaim the room. "You get up. Get up this instant." I don't know what you imagine you're doing, but a member of the kitchen staff does not put his hands on the daughter of one of our patrons. Someone fetch security. This boy has forgotten what he is. The phrase hung in the air, ugly and clear. What he is. Wesley did not get up, and he did not look away from Savannah, but something in the set of his shoulders changed the way a man braces against weather. It was Coach Moore who answered, and he did it without raising his voice, which somehow made it carry further. He stepped out of the crowd and put himself at the edge of the cleared space, and the look he gave the headmaster was the flat, unbothered look of a man who has seen actual emergencies and is not impressed by manufactured ones. "Sit down, Jeffrey," he said. "I've watched that boy set a broken wrist faster than the school nurse could find the kit. Whatever he's about to do, I'd let him do it before I let you embarrass yourself any further in front of 300 people with phones." The headmaster's mouth opened and Moore added quietly, "Sit down," and to the astonishment of everyone near enough to see it, the headmaster sat. But it was not Moore who turned the tide. It was the old woman by the window. Eleanor Brooks had risen from her chair the moment Wesley knelt, and she had been crossing the floor with the slow, deliberate care of the very old her cane tapping a path through the crowd. She arrived as the headmaster was sitting, and she did not waste a glance on him. Her whole attention was on Wesley's hands. "Stop," she said, not to him, to the room. "All of you stop. I want to watch this." Harrison Williams had reached his daughter from the other side, by then his face gray with the particular fear of a father who has run out of money to throw at a problem. "Get away from her," he said to Wesley, and his voice shook. "I have had every specialist on 3 continents put their hands on my daughter. I am not going to let some—" "Harrison." Eleanor's voice cut clean across his. "Look at his hands. Look at where he placed his fingers just now on the back of her chair. Do you know how many people alive can find that line by feel? I spent 40 years as a surgeon, and I can count them." She turned her sharp old eyes on Wesley, and there was something in them that was almost hunger, the recognition of one craftsman seeing another. "I don't know who you are, young man, but you were not taught that in any kitchen. I'll stake what's left of my name on it. Harrison, give him the room. If he is wrong, I will have made a fool of myself in public, and at 81 I have very little dignity left to risk. Let him try." The father looked at the old surgeon and at his weeping daughter, and at the boy who had not flinched through any of it, and the fight went out of him. He gave a single broken nod. Up at the front of the room, the orchestra had trailed into uncertain silence. Wesley turned his head toward the conductor and lifted his free hand, and his fingers moved through the air in a short, precise sequence, a pattern of beats and a tempo. The shorthand a Viennese ballroom conductor would know in his sleep. The conductor, a narrow man with silver at his temples, stared as though a statue had spoken to him. Then his face cleared into something like wonder, and he turned to his musicians and called a title under his breath and lifted his baton. The first soft notes of Tales from the Vienna Woods drifted out over the floor. The same waltz Wesley had played in the dark that morning returned to him now in full. He looked back at Savannah. "I'm going to explain this once," he said low, "and then I'm going to ask your permission, and you can say no." "Then explain," she said. "When you fell, they told your father the cord was severed, permanent, 12 times. He kept his voice even almost gentle, the way his father's notebook had taught him to speak to frightened people. "I've read the language they used. I think 11 of them were repeating the first one. I don't think the cord was severed. I think there's a place low in your spine where a fragment shifted and pinned a nerve root, and it's been pinned for 2 years, and everything below it went quiet. Not dead, quiet. Pinned things can sometimes be unpinned." He met her eyes. "It might not work. If it does, it's going to hurt because things that have been asleep for 2 years do not wake up gently. I won't touch you unless you tell me to." Savannah Williams had been promised miracles by men in better suits than his, and she had learned to hate the word hope for what it cost her every time it failed. She looked at the boy kneeling in a busboy's uniform on the most expensive floor in Charleston, and against every lesson the last 2 years had taught her, she believed him. "Do it," she said. He had her father and the coach help her from the chair to a long upholstered bench at the edge of the floor, and he asked her to sit forward, and he set his hands against her back through the silk of her gown, the way Eleanor had watched him do, finding by feel a thing that machines costing millions had failed to name. The room had gone so quiet that the waltz seemed to be playing for no one, so quiet that the smallest sound carried into every corner of it. 400 people leaned in. Eleanor Brooks stood 3 feet away with her cane planted and her breath held, watching his fingers as a hawk watches grass. "Breathe out," Wesley said. "All the way." Savannah breathed out. He moved his hands a fraction and pressed, and there was a sound, a single, soft, deep click low in her spine, not loud, but absolute, the sound of something seated after a long time out of place. She cried out. Not in pain at first, but in shock, her whole body going rigid, because for the first time in 2 years, she had felt something below the place where feeling had ended. "I felt that," she said, and her voice climbed and broke. "I felt there's warmth." Her hand flew to her father's wrist and gripped it. And then slowly, like the first creature stirring after a long winter, the smallest toe on her right foot moved. Harrison Williams made a sound that no amount of money had ever bought back from him, and pressed his free hand over his mouth and wept openly in front of every important person he knew. Wesley did not let the room turn it into a circus. "That's enough for now," he said, even as the murmur swelled toward applause. "That's all we do tonight. The nerve is waking up. It'll feel like fire as it does, and her muscles haven't worked in 2 years. This isn't finished. This is the beginning of months of real work." But the crowd was past hearing him. The wonder was loose in the room, now rolling outward, and not even he could fully hold it back. It was the wonder more than anything that broke Tracky Hamilton. He had been standing at the edge of the cleared floor, watching his cruelty curdle into something far worse than a bad joke, watching the girl he had humiliated become, in the space of a minute, the most important person in the room, with the help of a boy he had called the help. The humiliation of it overwhelmed whatever was left of his judgment. "It's a trick," he said too loud, his voice cracking down the middle. "It's a you all see that, don't you? It's staged. He's a bus boy. You're going to take the word of a kid who carries our drinks over 12 hospitals." He came forward fast, reaching for Savannah's arm, meaning to haul her up and prove she would crumple, meaning to break the moment the only way he knew how. "Stand up then. Go on. Show them all how." "Don't." It was Savannah who said it, and she said it with her hand already raised flat between herself and him, not flinching back, but holding him off her tear-streaked face suddenly and completely composed. The single word stopped him as if he had walked into glass. "I don't need you to believe it, Tracky," she said, and her voice did not shake now. "I don't need anything from you ever again. I just need you to leave." Coach Moore had already stepped in close on one side and Harrison on the other, the 2 older men simply filling the space between Tracky and the bench, with the solid fact of their presence, saying nothing that needed saying. Tracky looked from the father to the coach to the girl who was no longer crying, and he understood in the way that men like him always eventually understand that the room had turned and would not turn back. He retreated a step and another, and the crowd closed over the place where he had been. That should have been the peak of the night. It was not. Because as Wesley shifted to ease Savannah back against the bench, the thin chain at his collar loosened by the work, by the reaching, by everything, slipped its catch. The tarnished silver locket came free and fell and struck the marble and sprang open. Eleanor Brooks was nearest. She bent for it with the slow effort of her years and turned it to the light and went very still. She had suspected something from the first moment she saw his hands. The locket only finished a sentence she had already half written. Inside was a small, worn photograph of a man, a black man perhaps in his 40s, with kind, tired eyes and a doctor's collar, a face she had not seen in many years and had never expected to see again. "William," she breathed. Then louder, turning toward Harrison, her old voice unsteady for the first time all evening. "Harrison, this is the face in this boy's locket. Do you not know it? Look at him." She held it out. "This is Dr. William Williams." The name moved through the part of the crowd old enough to carry it. Harrison Williams took the locket in fingers that had stopped working properly and stared at the small photograph, and the color left his face a second time that night. "That's not possible," he said. "It's my father," Wesley said. He had risen from his knee at last, and he stood among the tuxedos in his gray uniform with his chin level, and the whole room had turned to him. "Dr. William Williams. He ran a free clinic in the mountains in West Virginia for almost 20 years. He didn't ask people what they could pay. He didn't ask them what they were. He set bones and delivered news and sat up all night with people the good hospitals wouldn't take." His eyes moved across the gathered faces. "Some of you were carried through your worst nights by his hands, or your families were, whether you ever knew his name or not." Eleanor Brooks pressed her own hand to her chest. "He operated on my great-niece," she said, almost to herself. 1999. A bad fall hours from any real hospital, and he stabilized her on a kitchen table and drove her down the mountain himself. We sent a check. He sent it back. He said he didn't heal people to be paid for it. She looked at Wesley with wet eyes. "You have his hands. God help me, you have his exact hands." For a moment, Wesley let himself feel the weight of being known. Then he set it down because there was a harder thing to say, and he had decided to say all of it. "My parents are gone," he said. And when they were gone, the clinic went too. There were debts a free clinic always has, and there was paperwork, and there were people who found it easier to let his work disappear than to keep it alive, easier to forget a man like that had ever built something than to figure out who would carry it on. His voice stayed level, which was harder than shouting would have been. "I went into the system. I came here on the one scholarship this school gives, and I learned very fast what I was allowed to be inside these walls. So I carried the trays. I refilled the water. I let every person in this room walk past me without a second glance, because my father taught me one thing above all others, and I have tried to live by it every single day since I lost him." He looked then at the 400 faces at the headmaster who had called him a kitchen boy at the silk and the diamonds, and the held champagne at the men in identical black who had watched a girl weep and done nothing. "He taught me that you heal because someone needs it," Wesley said, "not because someone is watching. I never needed any of you to notice me. I made my peace a long time ago with standing in the corner of a room like this." His voice dropped, and for the first time it carried an edge clean and cold as the click that had sounded in Savannah's spine. "But I will not hold a tray and watch this room turn that girl's pain into entertainment. That is the one thing I would cross any line you draw to stop. You can call me whatever you need to call me to feel comfortable again. I know exactly what I am. The question that should keep some of you awake tonight is what you turned out to be when a girl was crying, and all it would have cost you to help her was your dignity, which from where I've been standing for 3 years, none of you were using anyway." No one answered him. There was nothing in the etiquette of that room, for what he had just done, no polished phrase to smooth it over, no graceful way to pretend it had not happened. 400 of the most powerful people in Charleston stood in their finery under the chandeliers and could not meet the eyes of an 18-year-old busboy, while behind him a girl who had not moved her legs in 2 years sat on a bench with warmth returning to her feet, and the orchestra, not knowing what else to do, kept playing the soft-turning measures of tales from the Vienna woods into a silence that had stopped being polite and become something closer to shame. The silence held longer than any of them could comfortably bear, and in the holding, it changed. Shame is a heavy thing to stand inside of, and 400 people were standing inside of it at once, each of them privately doing the arithmetic of the last few minutes, counting how long they had watched, measuring how easy it would have been to step forward, arriving at the same unflattering answer. Wesley had not asked them to feel it. That was what made it land. He had simply named the thing, and then he had turned his attention back to Savannah as though the rest of them had already ceased to matter, which in that moment they had. It was Claire Delacroix who moved first. She set her untouched glass down on a passing tray with a small click that sounded enormous in the quiet, and she crossed the floor, not with any speech prepared, not with a grand gesture, just a young woman walking out of a crowd she had never quite belonged to. She stopped beside the bench and looked down at Savannah, and what she said was not eloquent. "I should have said something an hour ago," she said. "I watched and I told myself it wasn't my place. That was a coward's answer and we both know it. I'm sorry." Then she turned and stood beside Wesley deliberately, the way you stand beside a person to say whatever line is being drawn here, I am on this side of it. After Claire, others came. Not all of them, that was the truth of it, and the truer thing for being incomplete. Some of the 400 slipped quietly toward the doors and the valet stand and the safety of their cars, and they were the ones who would tell a carefully edited version of this night for years. But a few crossed the floor. An elderly couple, a man who had gone to school with Harrison 40 years before, a handful of the younger guests awkward and red-faced, learning in real time that courage is mostly just the willingness to be the second person or the fifth to do the obvious right thing. And the whole of it was being recorded because at the back of the room, mounted on a small tripod he had set up himself earlier in the evening, Tracky Hamilton's phone was still streaming. He had started the broadcast to capture his own triumph, a night among the city's finest, narrated for the benefit of people who envied him. Instead, it had captured everything. The room had fallen so silent during the healing that the broadcast caught even the quiet words, and what it missed the venue's own ceiling microphones wired for the evening's speeches did not. The broken doll remark, the turning away the boy who crossed the floor, the click and the cry and the moving toe and the speech, all of it had gone out live. By the time anyone thought to look at the screen, the number beside the little red dot had climbed into the tens of thousands, and outside those walls the story had already slipped past anyone's power to shape it. Harrison Williams did not look at the phone. He was looking at Wesley. He came around the bench slowly, this man who an hour before had ordered the boy away from his daughter, and he stopped in front of him, and for a moment the two of them simply stood there. The billionaire and the busboy separated by a single step and 200 years of the kind of distance that ballroom had been built to preserve. Then Harrison reached out and took Wesley's hand in both of his own and held it, and the gesture was somehow heavier than any bow could have been. "My family owed your father a debt I didn't even know we carried," he said, and his voice was unsteady, and he let it be unsteady in front of everyone. "He saved a child of this family on a kitchen table in the mountains and sent our money back, and we let his name disappear, and tonight his son refilled my guests' water glasses while I looked straight through him." His grip tightened. "There is no busboy in this room. There never was. There's a young man with his father's hands, and a girl who's going to walk because of them and the rest of us who have a great deal to answer for." He drew a breath. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life answering for my share of it. I'd like to start tonight if you'll let me." He turned to the room, then still holding Wesley's hand, and made the kind of promise that powerful men usually make only in private and then forget. He would put $50 million toward rebuilding the free clinic in West Virginia, restored under the name of Dr. William Williams, run the way its founder had run it, no questions about what a person could pay or what a person was. Not charity, he said. A debt. There was a difference, and he had only just that night learned it. As for Tracky Hamilton, the ending the world wrote for him was quieter than anyone baying for it might have wanted, and worse, for being quiet. He did not flee under a false name to some distant country. Life rarely grants the guilty so theatrical an exit. He simply left the party alone into a city that had watched the stream and decided what it thought of him. And in the weeks that followed, Bellwood Academy concluded that his enrollment was no longer compatible with its values, a decision that arrived with paperwork and committees rather than drama. The footage followed his family into rooms where it was not welcome. His father's name, which had been climbing toward higher office, stopped climbing. Whether Tracky would ever sit with what he had done and become something better than the young man in that video was a question the night did not answer. It left the door open, which was more mercy than he had shown anyone, and exactly as much as the story was willing to give. The miracle, the real one, took longer than a night because real ones always do. There was no walking out of that ballroom on her own 2 feet. What there was in the months that followed was work. The unglamorous, grinding daily work of a body relearning itself. There were specialists summoned now not to deliver verdicts, but to assist with something a teenager had been right about. There were parallel bars and pool sessions and mornings when nothing happened, and Savannah wept out of fury rather than pain. Wesley was there for a great deal of it, having traded the gray uniform for the unofficial title of the only person who had believed her spine could be unpinned before it was fashionable to believe it. He was patient with her the way his father's notebook had taught him to be patient, slowly, steadily refusing to waste a single day's progress. She walked the first time on a gray Tuesday in a rehabilitation gym with no audience at all, 6 unsteady steps between the bars, while Wesley counted under his breath, and afterward neither of them could speak. It was nothing like the ballroom. It was better than the ballroom. The ballroom had been the promise. This was the keeping of it. By the following autumn, Wesley had a letter from Johns Hopkins offering him a full place to study medicine, the same institution that in his father's day had kept its doors narrowed against men with his skin, and his story now opening them and calling it an honor. He kept the letter folded inside his father's notebook in the place where the man's careful slanting script ran out and the blank pages began, and he understood the symmetry of that without needing to say it to anyone. Savannah's healing turned out to be the kind that does not stay in one body. She finished her recovery, and then she went to law school, and she did not go quietly. She built a practice out of the 2 things she knew from the inside: what it was to be looked through because of a chair, and what it was to watch a system decide in advance what a person was worth. She became a civil rights attorney with a particular fury for the places where disability and race and medicine met and failed people, and she won often, and the city that had once watched her weep at a party learned to watch her in courtrooms instead. They danced again, of course. The story would not have been complete without it, and the people who tell stories like this one know that an ending has to rhyme with its beginning, or it does not feel like an ending at all. It was years later in that same Williams ballroom under those same chandeliers before a gathering of many of the same faces grown older. There was no wheelchair this time and no tray. Wesley wore a doctor's quiet confidence and a tuxedo that fit him, and Savannah wore a gown the color of pale champagne, and when the orchestra began the soft opening measures of Tales from the Vienna Woods, he held out his hand to her, palm up, steady, the way he had the first time. She took it without hesitation now. They turned across the floor together, and the room watched, and the watching had changed entirely. There was no line drawn across that marble anymore, none between the staff and the guests, none between the families that had built the place and the boy it had tried to overlook, none between the powerful and the people they had been raised to ignore. Eleanor Brooks was not there to see it. She had lived long enough to know how it came out, which she had said was all she had ever asked of her last years. But her great-niece was, and so were a good many people whose own worst nights had passed through the hands of a mountain doctor, whose name was now carved over the door of a clinic where no one was turned away. And the truth the whole long evening had been circling sat plainly in the middle of that turning floor, where anyone willing to look could find it. The dignity of a human being is not in the color of his skin, and it is not in a wheelchair, and it is not in the price of a tuxedo. It is in the hand that reaches out when the rest of the world has decided to turn away, and in the courage finally to take it.